Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that my running mate Angela Walker and I ran on in 2020. And today we have a guest, Mark Dunlea, who's going to be talking about climate. After I make a few opening remarks, we are both at the Green Party State Convention or Presidential Nominating Convention. Mark remotely, I'm there literally. It's at the Independent Media Center in Troy, New York, which Mark actually does a lot of reporting for. And I'm in the audio studio. And the convention, they're counting the votes next door. They should be done about the time we finish this podcast. So let me just say a few remarks. Congress left DC for another 16-day vacation last night, as if they have nothing they should be doing. There were no measures in the funding package that passed or anywhere else to cut off arms to Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. You know, the Canadian Parliament did that last week. Why couldn't our Congress do that? Well, you know, we need a Green Party. We need something beside what we got down there right now. The funding package they did pass had a terrible provision to ban support for UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, that provides food, health, education, and other services to Palestinian refugees in Gaza, which desperately needs them, but also Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. That's just mean-spirited. And the U.S. has been the biggest funder of UNRWA for decades. This has been going on since the 50s. And now with people starving in Gaza, they vote to cut the funding. I mean, this is a vote for genocide. And the bill also prohibits, and get this, getting to the climate, phasing out gas stoves. Heat pumps have become a scapegoat for the far right in this country as well as Europe, alongside immigrants. They use heat pumps and immigrants to blame, to explain why we have economic problems. I mean, this is just nuts. We should be ridiculing, the Republicans with all their talk about a national security threat at the border from these poor people just trying to survive and maybe get away from oppression. They're not a national security threat. The Republicans are like Chicken Littles running around. We should just make fun of them and just say, let's legalize immigration, like we did when we had Ellis Island, back in the 1800s. That's how many of our ancestors got here. They just went to Ellis Island, got registered, maybe got their old name spelled wrong, but then they came to America and went to work. That's what should be going on. And also, there was no movement on military aid to Ukraine for its self-defense, as Ukraine is now rationing artillery shells and is said to be running out of air defense missiles at the end of this month. Their shoot-down rate has gone from 90% to 50%, and Russia has pelted them with over 150 missiles in the last 2 nights. And they're striking, one of the worst strikes was a strike on the Zaporizhia Dam. They knocked out the hydroelectric center. A lot of that area is without power. These are crimes against humanity. But they go on. And without air defense, remember when Ukraine was asking for a no-fly zone? Well, they got it when they got Patriot missile anti-aircraft or anti-air defense missiles. And now they're going to lose that. And that means Russia's strategic bombers can come in and bomb, carpet bomb cities like they did Grozny, like they did Aleppo, like they did Mariupol, or like Israel's now doing to Gaza. That's where it's at. The Speaker Johnson, the Republican from Louisiana, now says he'll put forward a standalone Ukraine aid bill when he returns to Congress in April. But he says at the request of Trump, it's going to be in the form of loans instead of grants, which puts Ukraine deeper in the debt trap which it is in, and makes it basically lets Western capitalists dictate their social and economic policies on the neoliberal model. And now the far right crazies like Marjorie Taylor Greene are moving to replace Johnson because he got this funding package through, and she considers it a capitulation to Biden. So the dysfunction in this do-nothing Republican Congress is likely to continue right through the elections in November. And also, the spending package had nothing positive for the climate, only that negative anti-heat pumps, pro-natural gas stove thing. And this is in a week when the World Meteorological Organization officially certified last year, 2023, as the hottest year on record. And the average temperature was 1.45 degrees Celsius above what it was in the late 1800s. And of course, the UN target coming out of the Paris Peace Agreement was 1.5 degrees Celsius. So they're only 5/100ths of a degree short of busting through that limit, way ahead of schedule. And as Andrea Celeste Saulo, the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization, noted, quote, people began to destroy nature at an industrial scale and burned large amounts of coal, oil, and gas in the late 1800s. And so here we are, and temperatures rising faster than the climate science models predicted. These rising temperatures are making life more unpredictable, more expensive, and more dangerous. And meanwhile, fossil fuel capitalists like the Gulf state monarchs, like Donald Trump, like Vladimir Putin, like the head of Exxon, and the whole far right in America and Europe are attacking renewable energy, electric vehicles, and of course, heat pumps. And they're saying that the elimination of oil, gas, and coal is a fantasy. And we're in a problem because now they're predicting with artificial intelligence, after being flat for 20 years, US demand for electricity is likely to double over the next 5 years. So the Democrats keep watering down their limited climate measures like they did with the EPA rules this week to promote electric vehicles. So, that's why we need the Green Party. We need candidates at every level to push more than ever for an eco-socialist emergency Green New Deal for 100% clean energy, zero emissions, and public provision of basic economic rights, an economic bill of rights within a decade. So let me just stop my commentary with a little bit of good news. Trump is broke. He can't find anyone to cover his $500 million worth of bonds he has to do for the bank fraud case. And if he doesn't find it by Monday, which doesn't look likely, the New York Attorney General Letitia James will begin proceedings to seize Trump properties, like 40 Wall Street, the Trump Tower, and one of his golf courses in Westchester County. So Trump doesn't want to file. He might have to file for bankruptcy because it spoils his brand, especially during his presidential campaign. So politically, he may want to con the public by playing the victim when the New York Attorney General starts seizing his assets instead of going into bankruptcy. Of course, Trump is playing for time. That's what every legal maneuver he does is. And he's counting on winning the presidency so he can get his federal cases thrown out and then hopefully shut down the state cases like the New York bank fraud case, because as president, he said he will exact ultimate and absolute revenge on his enemies, which means New York, the courts in New York, the budget for New York. He could put a lot of pressure to get that case dropped too. He does have one more card up his sleeve, but it probably can't save him from this, and that is his true social media platform merged into a shell company, Digital World Acquisition Corporation, and could offer an initial public offering as soon as Monday. He has 60% of the shares at the current price that shell company is trading at, which is all about Trump. He could get a windfall of $3 billion. Now, there's a merger agreement that says he can't sell those shares for 6 months, but he controls the board. So he might could do that pretty short order. But in any case, we'll see how all this plays out. But I just think it's good news that Trump is squirming in this corner he painted himself into. So with that, I want to ask Mark Dunlea, who is a longtime Green activist. He helped found the New York Green Party back in about 1992. He's been active in movement politics since he worked with Ralph Nader to start the New York Purge in the 70s. Been active in clean energy, anti-poverty. He headed the Hunger Action Network in New York for decades. And now he's full time on the climate issue because it's an existential threat. So, Mark, I just wanted you to share with people, where your thinking is at on what we got to do, in terms of what's going on globally, nationally, even in New York State or states people listening might live in. So, take it away, Mark.
Well, as you undoubtedly remember, Howie, in 2010, when you were running for governor here in New York as a Green Party candidate, you helped launch the call for eco-socialist Green New Deal. Though, as you pointed out, actually, I guess back in 2000, you had promoted a very similar thing with the initial version of the Green Party. And that, of course, remains very relevant today. And the idea was we need very rapid action to cut emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, to zero, not net zero, but real zero, 10-year timeline. And then we have to combine that with the strong economic bill of rights, similar to what FDR did in his, I guess, 1945 State of the Union address, the right to a living wage job, a minimum income, single payer universal health care, affordable housing, and single payer. I mean, right to education, and that remains, very relevant today. Of course, a couple of years ago, Congress did pass what's called the Inflation Reduction Act, a very small version of Build Back Better, which sort of became Build Back, badly. And we're running out of time. You mentioned that the World Meteorological Organization, just released a report saying that climate change is just out of control. Um, you mentioned that they estimate that global warming is 1.45 degrees. There have been other reports that even put a little bit higher. Several actually came out above that 1.5 degree target. Now, the weather changes, and so just because, one year we hit the 1.5 degree target, it doesn't mean that we're permanently above that. But it's occurring much faster than the climate scientists anticipated. They don't exactly know why it went up so much. There seems to be a lot more problems with the ocean warming than they anticipated. And there's like 9 or 10 sort of sustainable life systems on the planet that we have to, sort of keep within. And on 6 out of those 9, we are now basically, in a crisis level. One of the big ones, of course, is species extinction. And maybe even Donald Trump understands that humans are a species. And when other species begin to disappear, that impacts upon the web of life and threatens human existence as well. So we need to speed up a whole lot faster than what Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Governor Hochul here in New York is doing. A report out last week saying that California, who many people view as sort of the best in the United States in terms of dealing with climate change, is way behind, actually meeting their climate goals. The head of the United Nations basically said that the world governments have not done enough to keep climate change under control. He talks about, we've opened up the gates of hell, and he's talking about what governments have actually pledged to do. And one of the problems is that we seldom actually have governments meet the pledges that they meet. California only is doing about 1/3 of what they needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions below their target level, which is too low. Same problem, in New York. So we need a, eco-socialist Green New Deal. We need the president, whichever president, declare a climate emergency, which unlocks other powers, but particularly climatepresident.org, lays out a comprehensive list of actions that our president could take to deal with climate. Earth Day to May Day, something that the Green Party has done for a number of years. We're doing a webinar on April 8th. I'll let you jump in with the question at this point because I could ramble on for quite a while about it. I will say, a lot of this lay out in a book I wrote, putting out the planetary fire. People can look at it for free on the Green Education Legal Fund website, gelfny.org. You can download it, you can read it on the internet, or there are clicks if you want to get a hard copy.
Yeah, I would recommend people look at that. Let's try to get that in the chat at some point here so people can. There it is. Chris, who's behind the screen, is fast, so he's got it right up. And once that's up, I wanted to mention an article that I recommend people read by John Pfeffer, and its title is The Critical Missing Piece from the U.S. Energy Transition. In other words, a clean energy transition. But the missing piece is where do we get all these minerals we need? There are over 50 that are needed for a lot of the solar and battery and electronic smart grid stuff that we need to make this transition. And what he points out is, the U.S. and China with their, back and forth tit for tat trade and tariff issues, instead of cooperating on how to get these minerals out to the markets that need them to do the green energy transition, are making it harder for those minerals to get around along with other things. So, he's saying the US and China, despite other differences which need to be discussed, like human rights, need to cooperate in this area if there's going to be a climate transition. So John Pfeffer lays that out well. In the current issue of Foreign Policy in Focus, which he directs, has another article on the minerals issue that's worth looking at too. So, yeah, why don't you, or let me ask you, do you have any further thoughts on, Biden versus Trump versus looks like it's going to be Stein for the Green Party, given that Trump's mantra is drill, baby, drill, stop all this green stuff. Biden is, let's do the green stuff, but actually let's do the fossil fuel stuff. It's still all of the above energy policy. We're the world's biggest oil and gas exporter in history. We're ahead of Saudi Arabia, we're ahead of Russia, we're ahead of everybody. While Biden claims, the Inflation Reduction Act, as you called it, I call it Build Back Badly, is being implemented as a, all the above kind of thing, including nuclear, which is another thing we could talk about. And then Jill Stein, trying to raise the banner of the Green New Deal, the real Green New Deal, not the watered down version that Markey and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put into Congress, which didn't get voted on anyway in the House because Pelosi wouldn't let them and the Republicans don't want to vote on it. And when it was voted on in the Senate, all the Democrats abstained because they said McConnell was pulling a trick on them, making them go on record in an election year, which I thought that was the point. So anyway.
Well, you raise a lot of points there. We really need to treat it like a climate emergency. We're out of time, and sort of the Trump obviously is a climate denier and absolutely horrible. Biden admits that climate is a problem, but he's unwilling to really confront the power and the profits and the campaign contributions of the fossil fuel industry. And, we're not going to solve climate change by basically giving more money to the hedge funds and the so-called, green capitalists. We really, we need system change, not climate change. And, we say that a lot, but it's really, serious. And, one of the things that even, Pope Francis said in his climate encyclical when he first, was elevated to Pope was that a lot of the reasons that humans exploit the environment is the same reasons why rich, powerful countries exploit, less powerful, less rich countries, why men exploit women, and why we oppress people of color, and people with different sort of sexual orientations. The issues are all connected. We need to create a different world, and actually both Pope Francis pretty explicitly and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have both made the point that in order to solve climate change, we have to get rid of capitalism. And that's something that the climate movement in the United States doesn't really talk about a lot. Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish activist, she's been making that point more recently, and there's been some authors in Japan that are doing it. We really need sort of a broad change. We need public ownership, starting with the energy system. When I say public ownership, I mean public ownership combined with democratic control, and of course, grassroots democratic control is best. But we also need more democratic public ownership of the overall economy. We need to create a different world. Um, the idea that human civilization as we know it may not exist by the end of this century should be a wake up call for people. And the reality is that many civilizations, in fact, not almost all civilizations throughout human history, eventually collapse. And they often collapse due to environmental concerns. And in many cases, there were solutions not only that existed, but there were solutions that the rich and the powerful knew existed. But implementing those solutions would challenge the power of the kings and the priests and the merchants. And so, therefore, they didn't do that. And that is exactly in the situation we are right now. And what happens with the Democrats is that they're willing to throw money at renewable energy, mainly for the hedge funds. They don't take enough action to reduce emissions. And the Democrats really promote a lot of false climate solutions. One of the, you mentioned nuclear power, but another one is this whole carbon capture and sequestration. And, the idea behind that is to allow the fossil fuel companies to continue to burn fossil fuels. And we'll try to capture the carbon before it gets released from the power plant or the facility, and somehow figure out how to store it and transport it. And it hasn't worked despite billions, tens of billions of dollars, and decades of research. And in fact, right before the recent COP in United Arab Emirates, the International Energy Agency, which is the mainstream, to me, corporate brainstorm data collector with the industry, they came out and they said carbon capture is an illusion. It's never going to be a solution to the climate crisis. And that we need governments and we need even the fossil fuel industry to stop promoting carbon capture. And what happened was Biden, Kerry, and the United States went to the COP28 and they lobbied very, very hard for, carbon capture. Fortunately, that didn't make it in as far as they went. But that's that's the type of things the United States is doing. And, it was nice because of political pressure that, Biden did say, let's put a temporary moratorium on, new permits for, liquefied natural gas, at least exports. But the reality is a lot of them have been built. You approved the Willow project. As you mentioned, the United States is the world's larger producer of fossil fuels, and partly because of the Russia invasion of the Ukraine, there was a lot of pressure, stop buying gas from Russia is fighting, it's funding its stuff, and so the oil companies made record profits. And what did they do with those record profits? Did they use it to invest in a transition to a clean energy future? No, they did it to increase dividends. They did it to buy back stock. They did it to invest in finding more fossil fuels. In fact, Christine Figueroa, who was the main negotiator for the United Nations for the Paris Climate Accords, came out maybe about a month ago and said she's given up on the fossil fuel companies ever playing a positive role in the transition to a climate free future. At the literally at the same time in New York State, our state controller, who I ran against back in 2018 on the investment issue, when you ran for governor, he came out and said that actually most of these big oil and gas companies, Shell, um, Occidental, BP, are actually pretty good on the climate these days. So we're going to continue to put $5 billion on them. He did say Exxon is really bad, but I'm only going to take what's the active part of my, couple billion in Exxon. So I'm going to take out $25 million from Exxon, but I'm going to keep $500 million. And, he's considered one of the more liberal Democrats um, about the climate issue.
Yeah, the oil companies aren't even greenwashing anymore. I think they're looking forward to Trump, they're backing him, and they want to drill, baby, drill. And that's, they for a while they were saying, we're going to transition, we're going to get involved in the renewables, cooperate with the smart grid. Now they ain't even playing. They just saying we're going to drill. And one of the things you mentioned, the International Energy Agency. Another thing they said, I think it was last year, was that if we're going to stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures, there can be no more oil and gas wells drilled, no new fossil fuel infrastructure. And this is kind of the corporate establishment, globally saying that because the data is so strong. Yet, the Green New Deal that AOC and Markey put into the Congress eliminated what we've been talking about, which is a ban on fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure. So, it's like if it's the Democrats, we're going 50 miles an hour, and if it's the Republicans, we're going 100 miles an hour toward that cliff with no brakes. It's not a good situation.
And one thing I'll just mention is that the banks continue to put enormous amounts of money into expanding fossil fuels. I think last year alone, worldwide, the 60 biggest banks put another $669 billion into fossil fuels. And, since the Paris Climate Accords, the amount of bank financing has been $5.5 trillion. So a lot of the groups who have been fighting on divestment, and we actually been able to get, I think it's close to $40 trillion now of various pension funds to say no, we're not going to put our money into fossil fuels. A lot of groups are now trying to find the banks. You got to stop financing expansion of the fossil fuel industry. And the same thing with the insurance companies. If the insurance companies are not willing to finance or insure the expansion of some of these plants, that would make it more difficult to operate. And then the other thing, and my wife sort of does this with Beyond Plastics, but plastics is sort of the new coal. And what the fossil fuel industry is trying to figure out is, okay, eventually we're not going to be able to do as much fossil fuel use as we were. So what should we do? And one of the things they're doing is they're moving very much using fossil fuel, particularly waste from fracking, to do plastics. And in a relatively short period of time, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from the production of plastics is going to exceed that, from coal. And even since the Paris Climate Accords, the worldwide level of global greenhouse gas emissions has continued to decline. It has declined somewhat in the United States, not enough, But some of the developing countries are now, they're trying to catch up with their economic development. China being the big one, they really, they've surpassed the United States in terms of being the world's leader. At the same time, one of the reasons why the solar industry has developed as much as it's had is because China invested very heavily in solar production, and that has driven down the worldwide price of solar. One can certainly justifiably say, oh, yeah, there's some real problems with labor standards in China, but at least they've been willing to sort of, invest in that. And, the United States, Democrats give a lot of lip service. They give rhetoric, but they just don't follow through. And in many cases, we need public ownership because we can't sit around and for the hedge funds to figure out, should we do it? Like, United States East Coast, we have one of the best places for offshore wind on the planet, but very little is getting built. And in New York State, the best place in the country is off of Long Island and in New York City. The initial contracts, they came back in European countries and companies and just said, prices are changing, we need more money. So they canceled the existing contracts, they're out the new bid, raising the prices. It'd be a lot cheaper and a lot faster if it was the government, federal, state, city, town, building itself, or worker cooperatives, or consumer cooperatives. You eliminate the 10, 15% profit margin that these hedge funds want to get out of it, and it's also a lot more public support. If it's a local government building a fossil fuel, not a fossil fuel, a renewable energy farm, community people have more of an ability to say, hey, how about siting it over here rather than over here, rather than allowing a private developer to make that decision. And, it's also considered more of a public benefit rather than just being, raising, profits for some, developer. And people feel, well, at least it's from the local government building. I got a little bit more ability to go down to town hall or city hall and yell and be heard. When it's these private companies yelling and building, I don't have any way to provide input. And the other thing similar to that is perhaps the biggest barrier to building renewable energy in the United States has been the transmission grid. And I think more than half of the renewable energy projects in the United States get canceled because they can't negotiate a viable agreement with the local utility, local owners of the transmission grid in order to connect. And that should all just be publicly owned. It'd be a lot cheaper. It would make it easier to coordinate. You could have, some type of form of, local ownership as well. But public ownership is essential to the climate crisis. And, I'm glad to see some other groups like DSA in recent years have sort of joined in the call for public ownership. I wish they were there a lot sooner, like the Green Party was, but they got to go a lot farther. And public ownership has to be combined with democratic control. And in all these things, of course, we're talking about making sure that we protect the environmental justice communities and also that we protect, workers. There has to be a just transition, which is one of the real key points of the initial Green New Deal that you proposed back in 2010, and which the Democrats and other groups even, watered down. I recently read the Squad, which is, about AOC and the others, and it was very interesting that when, the big thing to put the Green New Deal into national headlines was when AOC joined the Sunrise Movement at Pelosi's office to support a Green New Deal. What I didn't know until I read this book was that Sunrise Movement didn't support the Green New Deal. They wanted green jobs, which is nice. But it was actually AOC who said, oh, why don't we do this Pelosi demonstration in support of a Green New Deal? And said, okay, let's do that. And, it had been AOC's campaign manager who the previous year had run a campaign for a Green Party candidate over in Brooklyn, now a state senator. and we had helped introduce the Green New Deal to him. And part of the problem was AOC didn't know what a Green New Deal was. And, so after suddenly get all this attention, she was like, okay, we got to write it. We got to figure it out. Didn't bother to call us up or bother to look at what we already had. And then, of course, the more liberal Democrats like Markey came in and said, well, instead of doing it for 10 years, why don't we take 30 years? And, just watered it down, nothing like the original thing. But I had not known that, in fact, neither AOC nor Sunrise really had any understanding what the Green New Deal was when they protested at Pelosi's office, other than a broad concept.
Yeah, I knew that AOC got the slogan Green New Deal from VG Ramos, the campaign manager for her, and before that, Jabari Brisport, who ran as a Green, who was running on our Green New Deal.
Right.
But somehow the substance of a Green New Deal, AOC had it in her congressional campaign. She surprisingly won. And, if she'd wanted to know what was in the Green New Deal, she knew who to ask. It was the Green Party in New York. But she has never, acknowledged where it came from. And, there's no way she couldn't know unless she really wasn't even paying attention to her campaign manager. But in any case.
Well, but I think the other thing that's really shocking to me was these Democratic Green New Deals, even AOC initially, never said stop new fossil fuel projects, never said stop, fracking.
Yeah, and when they come forward, there are 10 different Green New Deal bills, like Green New Deal for public schools, Green New Deal for public housing, and so forth. None of them have called for stopping new fossil fuel infrastructure, banning fracking.
And none of them have actually ever come up for a vote, as far as I'm aware.
Except the non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal in the Senate when McConnell brought it up, and the Democrats didn't want to go on the record. Right. Oh man, we're in deep trouble. One of the candidates who was a Green before we had a Green Party, Barry Commoner, running on the Citizens Party. I know you supported him. I did. Petra Kelly, one of the founders of the Green Party in Germany at the time, said this is America's Green Party. He wrote a book called Making Peace with the Planet about 10 years later, 1990. And in it, one of the things that struck me, and this gets to plastics, is he said we've got to use materials that evolved within the biosphere. Because for every molecule within an organic, an organism, there's an enzyme that can break down its parts into components that other organisms can use as food and fuel. And therefore, instead of detergents, we should go back to soap. And instead of plastics, we should use glass and earthenware. I've seen recently silk, which is a biological product of silkworms, is a good packaging material.
Mushrooms.
Yeah.
We have a mushroom company right across the river when you're right at the moment. They make packaging as well as mushroom bacon.
And before the climate became such a headline issue, we were talking about this in the Green Party movement in the 80s and 90s, that we've got to get away from these synthetic, mostly petrochemicals that are not assimilated by the biosphere. So now, as somebody mentioned in the chat, all of us have these microplastics and nanoplastics in our bodies. And they're, a lot of these chemicals are carcinogenic, they're mutagenic, in other words, change your genes, or affect your endocrine system. So that it's really it's affecting us personally now, all of us. Right. And these nanoplastics are found in the deepest, Marianas Trench in the ocean, at the poles and the Arctic areas, and it's linked to fossil fuels. There's an article this week, I think it was in Truth Out, talking about the positive feedback between oil production and plastics production. And as the globe heats up, the plastics break down faster. So you got to replace them faster, which means you got to drill more oil to make more plastics and have the energy to make those plastics. It's like going down the toilet, circling around.
And I remember, maybe 30 years ago, because some family members, had cancer, I paid attention to the issue. And, one of the big women's groups on Long Island who did a lot of the leadership in the state, they were called 1 in 9. And that was because 1 in 9 women, came down with cancer during their lifetime. And now it's something like 1 in 3, and same thing for men. And the cancer rates continue to rise. And it's just, we put all these different chemicals, in our food, in our packaging. Um, we breathe it, we eat it, and one of the problems with science is that they tend to want to look at things in isolation. What is the impact of this one particular chemical on your body, rather than what is the impact of 100 different chemicals at a time that we're now absorbing, through our environment. And of course, the Greens embrace the idea of a precautionary principle. That you should not be allowed to introduce various chemicals into the products you're selling until you are able to show that, they're safe. If you can't show it's safe, don't do it. You need to be cautious. Whereas, our tendency is, well, let's let it go. And if there's a problem, we'll get rid of it, 20, 30 years later. Then, of course, it's so widespread, you're not going to get rid of it.
Yeah, you were talking about public ownership. There's more of a movement now than there's been in many years for public ownership of the railroads.
Very
And
common.
building
In
them out.
1980 was pushing public ownership of the railroads, well, particularly the railroad tracks.
Yeah, well, yeah, and Barry, was talking about public control or ownership, depending on the industry. Um, that was one of the little debates we had in there. I mean, he had been a socialist all his life, but he wasn't sure he wanted to run on that. So he talked about control. And then the left wing of the Citizens Party was saying, well, you already have corporate capture of the regulatory agencies. We got to capture the corporations. And that was a good debate. I think it educated a lot of us at that time on the importance of public ownership. But in the rails, I mean, this is a natural issue for the Greens. Remember Amtrak Joe? Whatever happened to him? Where's the inner city high speed rail? Where is the metropolitan public transit rails? Where's the serious move to get off the roads and onto the rails with freight, which is much more energy efficient? And you can do that electrified easier on the rails than you can on the roads.
Well, yes, where it is. I mean, one of the reasons where it is, of course, is just the enormous amount of money we spend on the military. And, that was one of the things we said about the Green New Deal. I think at least a 50% cut. I think eventually probably increased, 75% cut. But, these other countries, they don't put the money into the military corporate welfare package. They put the money into high speed rail. They put the money into schools and education and teachers and public housing. And, what, 56% of the discretionary federal budget, goes to the military. The one thing that the Democrats and Republicans agree upon is let's give more money to the military budget. And during the Trump years, the Democrats in Congress fought to raise the amount of money going to the military above what the United States, above what Trump was proposing. And, as Dwight Eisenhower said, what now, 60, 70 years ago, every dollar spent on tanks and airplane is a theft from those who are going hungry and, those going homeless. Affordable housing, certainly a major crisis in so many states. Um, we could be taking our tax dollars and investing in public housing. Instead, we're investing in 800 military bases, across the planet.
Or with public ownership, you can plan. And you can plan
Right.
to build densified communities, walkable communities, or restructure suburbs as well as inner city neighborhoods around that if you combine new public housing, affordable housing, with the mass transit so that people If they can't get it in their neighborhood, they can get on a bus or a trolley to get to where they need to in another part of the city. Uh, and that should be free. I mean, public transit in the cities should be free mobility, and it will save money in the long run because roads take up a third of the land. Land is valuable. You don't need roads as much, and you have accidents. Everybody maintaining their own vehicle is a lot more expensive than using free public transit and paying some taxes for it. So
Right.
there's a lot, and that's an argument for planning with
Well,
public ownership.
and I always say about mass transit, when my son graduated from high school 15, 20 years ago, we went backpacking through, Costa Rica and Nicaragua, sort of graduate and present. And Costa Rica had the worst public transit system in Latin America. So that meant if you stood on a road someplace, you probably had to wait 20 minutes before the next bus came along. Um, Whereas, where I live in New York State, which is 15 miles from the state capital, but it's a more rural area a little bit, we have one bus, 1 day a week. You know, we just have a terrible public transit system. I lived in New York City, which I did, about 10 years ago, because you could get anywhere through public transit, both the subway and the bus system. People are not going to use mass transit if it actually means turning a 20-minute trip into an hour and 40 trip. It really needs to be, and as an anti-poverty advocate working on mass transit, one of the problems was that our mass transit system was designed to basically take people from the suburbs and move them to the downtown in the morning, and then bringing them back out to the suburbs at night after work was over. And for a lot of low and moderate income workers, that wasn't their work pattern. They often worked odd hours. They would go cross town, and mass transit wasn't set up to deal with that situation.
When I do this,
And yes, I support electric vehicles, which New York and other places are in a terrible situation with the charging stations. But we should be funding mass transit. Putting 300 million electric vehicles on the road. That's not a transit solution.
I usually do this podcast in the Green Party office in Syracuse over what would be this shoulder. There's a map from 1903 of the city and its trolley lines. And everybody in 1903 lived no more than 2 weeks from a trolley line. And we know from, other reports from that period, the trolleys ran every 10 minutes. And they were, affordable for working class people because Syracuse was a working class factory town. So the transportation system back then was faster and easier and cheaper than it is now. Whereas if you don't have a car, you got to go by bus, and the buses come by not according to what the schedule says often. And I see people. I will get in my car, go downtown, take care of business, come back 90 minutes later, and the same people are standing at the same bus stop waiting for that damn bus. I mean, we have gone backwards, and it's all and homage to the auto industry, which basically bought up these public transit systems from the really starting in the early 30s and finished up in the 50s and trashed them. So they could sell for public transit, they sold buses, but mainly they want to sell individual people car. And we're even today, I'm working with the Papua New Guinea Greens Party. And I was having a discussion with them over WhatsApp the other day, and they were saying they're going to build a highway into the highlands where these tribal peoples live, and it'll give them an opportunity to develop. And I said, have you guys talked about rails? Railroads are a lot cheaper, take up less land, they're more green friendly. And he said they hadn't even talked about it. Right. And then but where they do have rails is over in West Papua, which is on the other side of the island of Guinea. It's a colony of Indonesia. The brutality of the Indonesian treatment of the Melanesian are black people, look African, but they're actually more related to people in Asia. Um, but the Indonesians, I mean, the racist brutality, I mean, physical brutality they're imposing on the Papuans uh, is terrible. But they do have a railroad over there, but it's for a mining company. The Chinese and American mining companies are exploiting the hell out of this, and Indonesia gets a cut. It's one of these colonies, occupations that nobody knows about. It's like 18th century, pillaging that's going on right now. So the Papua New Guinea Greens, they're meeting with the West Papuans to get a green party going in Indonesia. But part of their program is independence for Papua, West Papua, and they have a green. They call it the Green State Plan, I believe. But it's a Green New Deal. I mean, they're ready to go. But it's a shame that, given the way the world industrial system is and the influences, they're building roads instead of rails in undeveloped Papua New Guinea.
What we haven't talked about, I just want to mention, is geothermal. You have mentioned here heat pumps, which are good for individual homes, but geothermal is significantly more efficient than air heat pumps. And particularly in Europe, they've had district heat and district geothermal heat in. So you can serve 50 or 100 homes at once through a geothermal system. It is beginning to sort of take off here in the United States. And this is something that the utility companies are moving heavily into because they kind of see that gas may be petering out as an option. And they're like, oh, well, we can take these pipes and use it to move the geothermal around. So I think we should be promoting more district geothermal, but we also should be promoting public ownership of it. And instead of having the geothermal pipe systems um, owned by a private utility company, it should be owned by the Department of Public Works or a worker cooperative or some type of community nonprofit. New York has begun to very heavily move in geothermal because it's one of the things which the labor unions, the environmentalists, and at the moment, the private utilities are all supportive of. And when you get the private utilities and the labor, that's when the politicians, sort of give the green thumb. So even when there's been very little progress in passing climate legislation at the state level, this thermal heat network systems, have been getting approved and getting support from the politicians.
Yeah, I think I've been asked a lot of times on this podcast, uh, can we do a local Green New Deal? And I think, yeah, you can do a lot of things. Ithaca, New York is basically replacing all their gas, uh, heating and cooling and heating and cooking with heat pumps and electric stoves. And they did a whole inventory of everything in the city. And, that's part of the problem. Now they're trying to tackle transportation as well. So they're working on it. At the very least, if you're in a locality, you can say, you're running on uh, setting up a plan for a Green New Deal to get to zero emissions in our city, county, village, whatever it is. And of course, you can only do so much of it locally because making this transition requires an investment of money that you just can't tax for. You got to borrow it and invest it now, or else it's too late. Which means, in the end, you got to go to the state and federal government if you're a locality to get the funding you need to do this.
Well,
but once you've got a plan, then you got something you can show to your representatives at the upper levels. This is what we need to get to clean energy.
Well, Ithaca says they have a Green New Deal, and what they've been doing is raising $100 million in funding to basically decarbonize all buildings, private buildings as well as municipally owned buildings, installing heat pumps and, sort of, doing insulation. And there was a really good program in New York, actually by the Working Families Party, the one time I actually agreed with what they were doing. And it was called I think the Green Jobs, Green Homes campaign about a decade ago. And the idea was anybody could get an energy audit. And if anything, the energy audit came up with um, that had a 7-year payback period in terms of reduced energy bills paying for the capital investment, then the utility company had to pay for it, even if it was something that was not directly related to the utility company, like a new boiler. And then the utility companies would recover that through keeping the reduction in the utility bills. And the idea was to, fix up 1 million homes in New York State. And the law was passed. It was actually done initially by not Cuomo, Spitzer, and then Governor Patterson. But when Cuomo came in, well, it's not my program, so I'm not going to support it. And the banks and the utility companies didn't want to do it. So instead of doing 1 million homes, they did 10,000 homes. But there was another person. I thought he made an interesting argument, and he was like, when we're talking about doing this transition to a clean energy future, we're talking about, can we save human civilization on the planet? Which I'm kind of skeptical that we can do. We have the technology to do it, but we don't have the political leadership and the political will to stand up by the Democrats and Republicans to the utility companies. But his argument was that given that going to zero emissions really is a public benefit, that in fact we should view doing things like insulation in homes and making them energy efficient as really a public good, and so therefore it should be publicly financed. And I thought that was an interesting concept. I haven't heard any politician yet agree to do that. But I mean, he was like, listen, this is an emergency. We got to make this happen. We can't futz around here with these nickel and dime operations and, basically get enough funding to do, 1% of what's actually needed to be done.
And even there, the funding is in the form of subsidies, tax incentives, grants, uh, guaranteed loans, so that the decision making over what technology and what investments and when is left in the hands of the same damn corporations that got us into this mess.
Right.
And that explains why, for example, as you pointed out, these wind projects, market conditions change and these companies wait. If it was publicly owned, you'd do it knowing that in the long run, you're going to pay off the investment because people will be paying for their electricity. And so it does get paid, but it doesn't have to make a profit in the next quarter, which is what those Wall Street guys want. I mean, that's just another argument for public power. And, that's what the Democrat, it's a neoliberal approach. It's not even a Keynesian approach. I mean, Keynes at least talked about public employees doing public good. The example I like to use is the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 30s was a public agency. The people were public employees, and they had a national plan to, protect the environment, reforest, protect soils, stop erosion, and all the projects they did and all the parks they built. What we got now is a much smaller scale. That was a couple million people worked in that. Now we got 20,000 people in the, what they call it, the Civilian Climate Corps. And it's run through AmeriCorps. So the projects are done by mostly nonprofits or local governments that put in a grant proposal to AmeriCorps. So you got a whole layer of people reading grants, evaluating them. It creates a whole lot of paperwork for, some bureaucrats, whereas the old Civilian Conservation Corps had a plan, they hired the people and they did it on a much larger scale. That's the difference between the neoliberal approach that you get from the Democrats and even a Keynesian approach, let alone the socialist public ownership approach, which even the New Deal did in some respects, like with the Tennessee Valley Authority in Bonneville. And there were other projects they did. In fact, when it got to
well, they did rural electric cooperatives. That's how they electrified much of the United States. Was private industry was going to come out there. Let's do these, nonprofits. What is the only state in the country that has complete public ownership of their energy, well, not the energy system, but the electro system?
Nebraska,
Nebraska, not exactly a blue state.
let alone a red state in the sense of socialist.
Right.
How did the Republicans get the socialist color? That's the answer is it was on a map on TV and they started saying red and blue. It's crazy. It just like throws out hundreds of years of history, a couple hundred years of history. So, we didn't get to people's questions in the chat. But we can do that next week. I didn't plan to have a guest this week, but I got persuaded that I should drive through this snowstorm to the Green Convention and figured I'd have, one of the Greens on as a guest this week. But next week, let's go to questions. I saw Amy had a question about dues. That's a good thing to discuss. So, let's talk about that next week, Amy, and people bring their thoughts. The other thing I noticed in the chat was Ashley noting that the Green Bay Packers are publicly owned and they're kind of grandfathered into the National Football League, which otherwise the teams are owned by billionaires and they'll move out of your city in a minute. The reason the Green Bay Packers are in Little Green Bay, even though they have great support and it's a profitable operation, is because the public owned it. The Green Bay people weren't going to move. Well, let's move to Pittsburgh or St. Louis because we'll make more money. They said we're staying right here in Green Bay.
I will say, when you ran for state controller in 1998, when we first got ballot status, Al Grandpa Lewis was our gubernatorial candidate, and he was actually a bit of a sports fanatic. He actually did a lot of scouting for high school basketball players going to college. And he didn't agree with this, but he allowed me to do this as his campaign manager. At that point, George Steinbrenner was pushing the New York City to give him $1 billion to move the Yankees from Yankee Stadium in the Bronx and build a new stadium facility in Manhattan. And I got Al to put out a press release that for $1 million, we should just take the Yankees over by public domain and make them publicly owned like the Green Bay Packers were.
Yeah, and we did the same thing when the Buffalo Bills were threatening to move from Buffalo if they didn't get a new stadium. And they got a new stadium, and the governor's husband,
$800 million or something.
Yeah, almost $1 billion.
Right.
And the governor's husband has concessions in the stadium and business with the casinos that are around the stadium. It's crooked and dirty as hell. And they might as well be Donald Trump, except Trump would lose money. He'd bankrupt the casino and probably the football team.
None of these public investments in stadiums, arenas ever make it the tax dollars back. It's every study finds that it's a loss leader for the local economy, but it's just pure politics. The numbers don't back it up because Ralph Nader was Ralph being another sports fanatic, especially on baseball. As you may remember, Ralph, actually under the radar supported Jimmy Carter for president in 1976. And the way that Ralph showed his support for Jimmy Carter, who initially campaigned as an anti-nuclear candidate, was that he went to Plains, Georgia, and umpired a softball game between a softball team by Jimmy and a softball team by Billy, his brother. But Ralph was always very big in opposing sports stadiums, public subsidies for sports stadiums.
I believe everything about that story except Carter being anti-nuclear.
It is the reason I left the Democratic Party in 1976, because Carter campaigned against nuclear power. And then as soon as he got elected, he appointed James Schlesinger as the head of the Department of Energy, very pro-nuclear. One of our big things, another Ralph Nader issue, was something called lifeline rates long, complicated thing. But instead of giving volume discounts, which no longer made any economic sense to the large users, because now every new power plant was actually increasing the overall cost of electricity, you should give a small amount of electricity to people at very nominal rates. And Jimmy campaigned and supported lifeline rates. And then when he got elected, he proposed to Congress lifeline rates, but only for senior citizens. And then when Congress got through with it, the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, it was made, every state was supposed to consider it and for seniors. And the only state that actually ended up doing it was California. And I believe that was done by the initiative and referendum. And then, of course, he bailed out, saved the nuclear industry at the 3 Mile Island.
Carter after 3 Mile Island? No, that was
No,
Reagan.
that was Jimmy Carter. And the first time I ever went
3 Mile
viral,
Island. Yeah, right, right.
I had this job in 1980, um, trying to convince both political parties to oppose nuclear power and support wind and solar. And I spent a lot of time talking to guys like Ronald Reagan and John Anderson. But the thing that went big, we were in Pennsylvania, and this guy Gene Stilp, it was actually my idea. I was like, let's go down to Jimmy Carter's headquarters, and let's give him an 8-foot atomic peanut. And we were in Harrisburg, which is only a couple miles from 3 Mile Island. And Gene said, 8 foot. Why don't we build a 40-foot atomic peanut and put it on the back of a flatbed truck, and let's drive the flatbed truck from on primary day in Pennsylvania from the state capitol down to the White House, because 4 days later there was a big anti-nuclear demonstration taking place at the Washington Monument. I convinced Doug Phelps, who was the guy funding the whole campaign for safe energy, that Gene knew what he was doing, that Gene could build this, and Gene did it. And it was like 2 out of the 3 national networks covered it. It was on the front page of 1,000 newspapers. And Gene has become Mr. Prop Man for Nader and the Pergs and stuff like that.
I'm thinking back when we were fighting Seabrook in 1976. Fred Harris was against it, but Jimmy Carter wasn't. He might have had a position.
Fred was definitely better than Jimmy.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well,
I was supporting Fred in the primary, but Ralph was the one who was supporting Jimmy in the general election.
Yeah, I even know.
And in his way that Ralph does things.
I even know a hardcore anti-nuke person that is still well known. I won't say who it was, but I remember him saying, and he was one of the initial clamshell people. He wanted to see Jimmy Carter in the White House because it would be good theater. Good theater. Good news. It would be fun to watch. I didn't buy that. I voted for the People's Party. But anyway, Mark, I appreciate you being on. And
just one thing. Speaking of the People's Party, I don't know if he ran as a People's Party. Who did Ron Daniels run on?
Campaign for a New Tomorrow. That was 1992.
I saw that Ron Daniels is one of 9 people that has been appointed to the Reparations Study Commission in New York State. And they have a year to come up with a plan on how to do reparations in New York State. So you should get Ron Daniels on.
That's a good idea. And somebody said I should have Jill on, and we'll do that too. For people that don't know, Ron Daniels was one of the organizers of the National Black Political Assembly in 1972 in Gary, Indiana. Very pivotal event. The Progressive Democrats went back into the Democratic Party. The Congressional Black Caucus got formed. And then another group formed the National Black Independent Political Party, which didn't last that long because, it got formed in early 80s. That was kind of the evolution of the National Black Political Assembly, which also met in Little Rock and I think Philadelphia. And then they formed a party, and then Jesse Jackson ran. They folded into it. But Ron Daniels was Jesse Jackson's campaign manager and then executive director of the Rainbow Coalition when it was still an independent organization. And then when Jackson took the Rainbow Coalition into push, Daniels tried to take the Rainbow Rainbow Coalition base into independent politics. And it didn't work. I mean, his campaign really didn't take off. The only place it worked was Mel King and Bill Strickland in Massachusetts formed the Rainbow Party there, which later merged into the Green Party. So it's the Green Rainbow Party in Massachusetts. So just to give people background on who Ron Daniels is, I didn't know that, but that's good. They didn't appoint Alice Green.
They did not.
Alice Green is a Green, probably most prominent civil rights activist, anti-police brutality activist in Albany and really New York State. She was our lieutenant governor candidate with Grandpa Al when we first got a ballot line.
25% of the vote. You're in for mayor as a Green Party candidate in the city of Albany.
Yeah, and she got like 35% or something, right? 25? Okay. Yeah, and she's been talking about reparations for a long time. So it's too bad they didn't appoint her, but I guess she's in the wrong party. Ron went back to
I was surprised they appointed Ron. I was like, ooh.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised too. But anyway, thanks again, Mark, and everybody.
Well,
will be back here
Howie.
next week.
Remember, April 8th, 8 p.m., we'll be having a webinar on Earth Day to May Day. And putting out the planetary fire, Green Education Legal Fund of New York, GELFNY.org. You can get it.
And that's that webinar is by the Eco Action Committee of the National Green Party.
That's correct.
And we'll be here next week at 3 p.m. So thanks everybody for being here, and we'll see you next week.